assess the weight of betrayal is heaviest when it comes from the hands meant to hold you. But sometimes, the broken pieces we gather become the sharpest weapons we wield. If you've ever felt the sting of betrayal from someone who was supposed to protect you, stay until the end of this story. It will shake you, heal you, and remind you that justice always finds its way home. And if this story touches your heart, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. We bring you real stories of survival, strength, and the sweet taste of justice that life sometimes serves cold. The rain fell like tears from heaven on the day 8-year-old Emma Clark stood outside the iron gates of Riverside Manor, clutching a worn teddy bear to her chest. Her small frame shivered, not just from the cold October wind, but from the emptiness that had hollowed out her world 3 weeks prior, when her father's car had collided with a truck on Highway 92. Thomas Clark had been her entire universe, her protector, her storyteller, her hero. Now he was gone and Emma was left in the care of a woman she barely knew, her stepmother Victoria. Victoria Clark stood at the top of the marble steps, her crimson lips curved into what might have been mistaken for a smile, if not for the coldness in her pale blue eyes. She was beautiful in the way ice sculptures are beautiful, perfect, untouchable, and devoid of warmth. She had married Emma's father only 18 months earlier. A whirlwind romance that had swept Thomas off his feet, after Emma's biological mother had died from cancer when Emma was just 4 years old. Emma had never warmed to Victoria, sensing something predatory beneath the designer dresses and practiced laughter. Her father had been too in love, too desperate for companionship, to see what his daughter instinctively felt. Calm inside her, Victoria said, her voice smooth as silk and just as cold. Standing in the rain won't bring your father back. Emma climbed the steps slowly, each one feeling like a journey toward an uncertain fate. The house that had once been filled with her father's booming laugh and warm embraces now felt like a mausoleum. The servants who had known her since birth averted their eyes as she passed, and Emma wondered if they too sensed the shift in the air, the way power had consolidated in Victoria's perfectly manicured hands. The first few weeks after her father's death passed in a blur of grief and confusion. Emma spent her days in her room, surrounded by memories of happier times, photographs of her father pushing her on swings, teaching her to ride a bicycle, reading bedtime stories with silly voices that made her giggle until her stomach hurt. But slowly, insidiously, things began to change. It started small. Victoria dismissed Mrs. Henderson, the housekeeper who had been like a grandmother to Emma, replacing her with cold, efficient staff who followed Victoria's orders without question. Then came the restrictions. Emma was no longer allowed to play in the garden her father had designed specifically for her. Her friends from school were told she was too busy with private tutoring to have visitors. The warm, honey-colored bedroom her father had decorated was stripped of its cheerful paintings, and replaced with stark white walls that felt like a prison cell. But the cruelest blow came on a gray November morning, when Emma overheard Victoria speaking with a man named Richard Thornton in her father's study, the room that Victoria had claimed as her own within days of the funeral. "The trust is airtight," Victoria hissed, her composed facade cracking to reveal the venom beneath. "Thomas left everything to that brat until she turns 21. I get nothing but a monthly allowance until then. Do you understand what that means, Richard? I married that boring fool for his fortune, and now I'm stuck playing nursemaid to his whiny daughter for 13 more years." Emma pressed herself against the wall outside the study, her heart hammering so hard, she thought it might burst through her chest. The teddy bear her father had given her for her 7th birthday dangled from her fingers, suddenly feeling like the last solid thing in a world turning to quicksand beneath her feet. "There are ways," Richard replied, his voice oily and calculating. "Accidents happen to children all the time. A fall down the stairs, a drowning in the pool, a tragic house fire. Don't be stupid," Victoria snapped. "An 8-year-old dies suspiciously right after her father's death. Even the incompetent police in this town would investigate. No, we need something more subtle. We make her life so miserable she becomes troubled, unstable. Then, When she inevitably acts a breakdown, we have her declared mentally unfit. With me as her guardian, I'd control the trust. We could bleed it dry before she ever reaches 21. And by then she'll be so broken no one would believe a word she says." Emma didn't wait to hear more. She ran to her room on silent feet, locked the door, and curled up in her closet, trembling with a fear she had never known existed. This was different from missing her father. This was the terror of knowing that the only person who had legal authority over her wanted to destroy her. The campaign of cruelty began the next day. Victoria enrolled Emma in St. Augustine's Academy, an elite boarding school 2 hours away, where she would only return home for holidays. But before Emma left, Victoria made sure to spread carefully crafted lies to the school administrators and Emma's new teachers. Emma was troubled. She told them with tears glistening in her eyes. The poor child had taken her father's death very badly and had begun acting out, lying, stealing, having violent tantrums. Victoria was at her wit's end, and hoped the structured environment and counseling at St. Augustine's might help her stepdaughter heal. None of it was true, but Victoria was a masterful actress. She provided forged psychological evaluations, manipulated photographs, and even bribed a corrupt child psychologist to testify to Emma's supposed instability. When Emma tried to defend herself, to tell the truth about Victoria's cruelty, she was met with sympathetic smiles and patronizing pats on the head. "It's normal for children to lash out after losing a parent," the school counselor told her. "But making up stories about your stepmother won't bring your father back, Emma." At St. Augustine's, Emma was isolated and ostracized. Victoria had done her work well, poisoning the well before Emma even arrived. Teachers watched her with suspicion. Other children, taking their cues from the adults, avoided her or worse, tormented her. She was the girl whose grief had made her crazy, the girl who couldn't be trusted. Emma retreated inward, building walls around her heart to protect what little remained of herself. She stopped trying to tell the truth because no one would believe her. She stopped crying because tears changed nothing. She became a ghost drifting through the hallways of St. Augustine's, present but not really there, surviving but not living. The holidays were worse. Victoria would summon Emma home for Christmas or Easter, but only to maintain appearances for the few family friends who still checked in. Behind closed doors, the torment intensified. Meals were withheld as punishment for imagined infractions. Emma's clothes were replaced with ill-fitting, unflattering items from charity shops while Victoria paraded around in designer labels. The trust that should have provided for Emma's every need was instead funneled into Victoria's lavish lifestyle, while Emma was given barely enough to survive. "Your father would be so disappointed in what you've become," Victoria would whisper to Emma during these visits, her voice dripping with false sadness. "A lying, ungrateful little wretch. It's a good thing he's not here to see what you are." Each word was a knife, carefully placed to inflict maximum damage. And Emma, still just a child, began to believe them. Maybe she was broken. Maybe there was something wrong with her. Maybe she deserved this punishment for some crime she couldn't name. But deep down, in a place Victoria couldn't quite reach, a small flame of defiance continued to burn. The turning point came during Emma's 10th year, during a particularly brutal winter break. Victoria had been drinking, something she did more and more frequently as the years passed and the trust money didn't flow as freely as she'd hoped. In her drunken rage, she had grabbed Emma by the arm, her nails digging crescents into the girl's pale skin. "You're nothing," Victoria snarled, her breath reeking of gin. "Your father didn't even really want you. Did you know that? He told me once that having a child had ruined his life with your mother. Trapped him in a marriage that was already dying. You were a mistake, Emma. An unwanted burden." Something inside Emma broke that night. Not in the way Victoria intended, not a breaking that led to surrender. Instead, it was the breaking of naive faith in adults, in fairness, in the belief that good would triumph simply because it was good. In that moment of shattering, Emma found something harder and sharper. A determination forged in the furnace of suffering. She would survive this. And someday, somehow Victoria would pay for every cruelty, every lie, every stolen moment of childhood. Emma began to watch Victoria the way a prisoner studies a guard, learning patterns and weaknesses. She became a shadow, unobtrusive and forgotten, which gave her freedom to observe. She noticed how Victoria met with Richard Thornton regularly. How money was slowly disappearing from the household accounts. How Victoria's spending grew increasingly reckless. She started keeping a journal, hidden in a loose floorboard in her bedroom, documenting every incident, every cruelty, every insider who came and went from Riverside Manor. At school, Emma transformed herself. If people thought she was broken, she would use that assumption as armor. She became excellent at being invisible. At giving teachers and counselors exactly what they expected to see, a damaged but compliant girl who was making slow progress. She excelled academically because knowledge was power, and she was hungry for any advantage. She learned to hide her intelligence, to seem just average enough to avoid attention while secretly devouring books on law, finance and psychology. By the time Emma turned 13, she had grown from a frightened child into something else entirely, a survivor with a plan. She had managed to squirrel away small amounts of money, hidden in various places Victoria would never think to look. She had made careful notes of every financial irregularity. She could document every meeting between Victoria and Richard, every lie her stepmother told to the outside world. She didn't know yet how she would use this information, but she knew someday it would matter. The year Emma turned 14, Victoria made her biggest mistake. Richard Thornton had convinced Victoria to invest heavily in a real estate scheme that promised enormous returns. To do so, Victoria had forged documents claiming Emma's consent as a beneficiary of the trust, siphoning off hundreds of thousands of dollars. The scheme collapsed spectacularly, and the money was gone. Victoria was desperate, her carefully constructed life of luxury crumbling around her. In her desperation she became careless. Emma found the forged documents in Victoria's study one night, when her stepmother was passed out drunk in her bedroom. She photographed every page with a cheap phone she'd bought with her saved money, then carefully retrieved everything exactly as she'd found it. For the first time in 6 years, Emma smiled, really smiled. Victoria had finally given her something concrete, something undeniable. But Emma wasn't ready to act yet. She was only 14, still legally powerless. She needed to wait to plan. To become strong enough to fight back against an adult who had resources and respectability on her side. So Emma continued to play the role of the damaged, compliant girl while inside she sharpened herself into a weapon. The next 4 years were a strange purgatory. Emma knew she had evidence of Victoria's crimes, but she also knew that exposing them prematurely might backfire. Victoria still had connections. Still had the sympathy of those who saw her as the noble stepmother struggling with a difficult child. Emma needed to wait until she was 18. Until she had legal standing of her own, until she could fight Victoria on equal ground. During this time, Emma began to carefully rebuild relationships with people her father had known, family friends, business associates, lawyers who had worked with Thomas Clark. She was subtle about it, reaching out with the guise of wanting to honor her father's memory, or seek advice about her future. These people remembered Thomas fondly and were surprised and pleased to hear from his daughter. Emma never mentioned Victoria's abuse directly. Instead, she planted seeds, asked innocent questions that made these adults start to wonder about the truth of the situation at Riverside Manor. At 16, Emma secured a part-time job at a local law firm through one of her father's old friends. She worked as a file clerk and office assistant, but more importantly, she soaked up knowledge like a sponge. She learned about trust law, about guardianship, about financial fraud. The lawyers at the firm saw a bright, hard-working young woman and had no idea they were training someone who would soon need those very skills to reclaim her stolen life. By 17, Emma had transformed entirely. The frightened 8-year-old was gone, replaced by a young woman with steel in her spine and fire in her eyes. She was beautiful like her mother had been, with dark hair and strong features. But there was something harder in her gaze, the look of someone who had survived hell and refused to be broken by it. Victoria noticed the change and it made her uneasy. The girl she had spent years crushing was standing straighter, speaking with quiet confidence, looking at her with eyes that seemed to see everything. Victoria increased her cruelty during Emma's brief visits home, as if trying to beat the girl back down to size, but it no longer worked the way it once had. Emma endured with a patience that was somehow more unsettling than rebellion would have been. "What are you planning?" Victoria demanded one night, cornering Emma in the kitchen. "You think you're so clever, don't you? You think turning 18 changes anything? I'm still your guardian until you're 21, and everyone knows you're unstable. No one will believe a word you say." Emma looked at her stepmother with calm, level eyes. "I'm not planning anything, Victoria. I'm simply waiting." "Waiting for what?" "For justice," Emma said simply. "It always comes eventually. Even for people who think they're too clever to be caught." Victoria laughed, but it sounded forced. "You sound insane. Maybe it's time for another evaluation by Dr. Morrison. I'm sure he'd be very interested in these dilutes you're having." Depro. Morrison was the corrupt psychologist Victoria kept on retainer, the one who provided false diagnoses in exchange for generous payments. But Emma had learned that Dr. Morrison was being investigated by the medical board for ethical violations in other cases. She had learned a lot of things over the years, gathering information the way squirrels gather nuts for winter. Emma just smiled. "Whatever you think is best, Victoria." That smile haunted Victoria for weeks. Emma's 18th birthday came and went with little fanfare. Victoria had forgotten to acknowledge it. But Emma didn't care. What mattered was that she was now legally an adult. The trust was still under Victoria's control for 3 more years. But Emma had other advantages now. She could sign contracts, hire lawyers, testify in court without needing an adult advocate. The day after her birthday, Emma met with Harrison Mitchell, a lawyer who had been her father's closest friend and the executor of his will. Harrison had watched Emma grow up and had always harbored quiet doubts about Victoria's story of Emma's supposed instability. The bright, articulate young woman sitting across from him bore no resemblance to the troubled child Victoria had described. "Mr. Mitchell," Emma began, her voice steady and clear, "I need to tell you something about my stepmother. And I need you to listen with an open mind. Everything you've heard about me for the past 10 years is a lie. Victoria has been systematically abusing me and embezzling from my father's trust. And I can prove it." For the next 3 hours Emma laid out her evidence. She showed him the journal she'd kept, detailing years of abuse and neglect. She showed him the photographs of the forged documents Victoria had used to steal from the trust. She provided bank statements she'd managed to obtain showing the pattern of unauthorized withdrawals. She even had recordings. In recent years she'd managed to capture Victoria and Richard discussing their schemes, not knowing Emma had hidden a small recording device in the study. Harrison Mitchell's face grew darker with each revelation. He had suspected something was wrong. But the scope of Victoria's deception and cruelty was staggering. When Emma finished, he sat back in his chair, looking at her with a mixture of admiration and sorrow. "Amma," he said slowly, "I am so sorry. Sorry that no one protected you. Sorry that I didn't dig deeper when things didn't add up. Your father would be devastated to know what you've endured." "My father trusted Victoria," Emma said quietly. "He couldn't have known. She's very good at deception." "What do you want to do?" Harrison asked. "We have enough here for criminal charges, fraud, embezzlement, possibly child abuse. Victoria could go to prison for a very long time." Emma had thought about this moment for years, imagined it in countless scenarios. She had expected to feel triumphant, vindicated, maybe even cruel. But sitting in Harrison's office, finally on the verge of justice, what she felt was something more complex, a mixture of relief, sadness for the childhood stolen from her, and a weary kind of determination. "I want my life back," Emma said. "I want control of my trust. I want Victoria out of my father's house. And I want the world to know the truth about who she really is. But Mr. Mitchell, I don't just want punishment. I want to rebuild. I want to honor my father's memory by doing something good with what he left me." Harrison smiled. "Your father would be very proud of the woman you've become, Emma. Let's make this right." The legal proceedings that followed were swift and devastating for Victoria. Harrison brought in forensic accountants who uncovered even more theft than Emma had documented. Richard Thornton was arrested trying to flee the country. Dr. Morrison lost his license and faced criminal charges for his role in providing false psychological evaluations. Victoria tried to fight back, tried to spin her usual lies, but the evidence was overwhelming. More damning were the recordings of her own words, her voice dripping with contempt as she discussed destroying a child for money. The judge who reviewed the case was visibly angry, and Victoria's high-powered lawyers could do nothing against the mountain of documentation Emma had compiled. Within 6 months, Emma had full control of her trust. Victoria was facing multiple felony charges, and Riverside Manor was Emma's once more. But the story didn't end there. Emma could have simply exiled Victoria from her life and moved on. The criminal justice system would handle the rest. But Emma had learned something during her years of suffering. She had learned that true strength isn't about revenge. It's about transformation. She had learned that the best way to defeat someone who tried to destroy you is to become someone they could never destroy, no matter how hard they tried. So Emma made a choice that surprised everyone, including Victoria. She offered Victoria a deal through their lawyers. Emma would not press for maximum criminal penalties if Victoria agreed to several conditions. She would surrender all claims to the Clark family estate, publicly admit to her crimes and apologize, enter genuine therapy to address her own demons, and spend 5 years working with a charity Emma planned to establish. A foundation for children who had been abused or neglected by guardians. Why? Victoria asked when they met face to face for the first time since the truth had come out. Victoria looked haggard, her careful beauty crumbling under the weight of her exposure. Why would you show me any mercy? I destroyed your childhood, I tried to break you. Emma looked at the woman who had haunted her nightmares for a decade, and realized Victoria was she remembered. More pathetic than terrifying. Because I'm not you, Victoria. You tried to make me bitter and cruel, tried to turn me into something broken beyond repair. But all you really did was teach me the value of kindness by showing me what happens when it's absent. I'm giving you a chance you never gave me. The chance to become something better than your worst impulses. Victoria stared at her former stepdaughter in disbelief. You should hate me. I did, Emma admitted. For a long time, hating you was the only thing that kept me going. But I don't want to carry that anymore, it's too heavy. And I have too much I want to build. So I'm putting it down. What you do with the opportunity I'm giving you is up to you. You can accept this deal and maybe find some redemption, or you can fight it and spend the next decade in prison. Your choice. Victoria took the deal. The foundation Emma established was called the Thomas Clark Foundation for Children's Advocacy. Using her inheritance wisely and with guidance from trusted advisors, Emma created something her father would have been proud of. A network of support for children trapped in situations like hers had been. The foundation provided legal assistance, therapy, safe housing, and most importantly, people who would actually listen and believe children when they reported abuse. Victoria, as part of her agreement, worked at the foundation's administrative offices. She was supervised and had no direct contact with children, but she processed case files, arranged resources, and saw daily the impact of abuse on young lives. Emma never knew if Victoria truly changed or if she simply went through the motions to avoid prison. But several years into her service, Victoria made an unsolicited appointment to speak with Emma. I don't expect forgiveness, Victoria said, her voice lacking its former polish and arrogance. And I don't deserve it. But I need you to know that working here, seeing these children, reading their stories, it's shown me what a monster I was. You were just a little girl who'd lost her father, and instead of helping you heal, I tried to destroy you for money. There's no excuse for that. No justification. I was cruel because cruelty came easily to me because I only cared about myself. Emma listened without interrupting. I know I can never undo what I did to you, Victoria continued. But I'm trying to at least help prevent it from happening to others. That's all I can do now. Make what tiny amends I'm capable of. Then keep doing it, Emma said simply. Not for me, but because it's the right thing to do. 8 years after that terrified 8-year-old girl had stood outside Riverside Manor, 18-year-old Emma stood in the same spot, but everything was different. The house was warm again, filled with light and laughter. Emma had enrolled in university, studying child psychology and law. Determined to understand and dismantle the systems that had failed to protect her. She had reconnected with Mrs. Henderson. The kind housekeeper Victoria had dismissed, and invited her to return to Riverside Manor, not as an employee but as family. Emma had also found love. Not the dramatic, consuming kind, but the steady, supportive kind that helped her continue healing. James was a graduate student she'd met through the foundation. Someone who understood trauma and recovery, because he'd survived his own difficult childhood. They were taking things slowly. Building something real on a foundation of honesty and mutual respect. But perhaps most importantly, Emma had found herself. Not the girl she might have been if tragedy hadn't struck, but the woman she had forged herself into through fire and suffering and ultimately, transcendence. She was stronger than she should have had to be. More compassionate than anyone would have blamed her for not being, and more determined than Victoria could ever have imagined. One evening, Emma stood in her father's study, her study now, looking at a photograph of Thomas Clark. In it, he was laughing, his arms around a much younger Emma, both of them covered in dirt from planting flowers in the garden. "I hope I made you proud, Dad," she whispered to the photograph. "I didn't let them break me. I didn't let hate consume me. And I'm using what you left me to help kids like I was. Kids who need someone to believe them, to fight for them, to show them that surviving isn't the same as living. And that they deserve to do both." The man in the photograph seemed to smile back at her, forever frozen in a moment of pure joy with his daughter. Emma's story spread through the community and then beyond. Newspapers picked it up, then national media. Not because of the dramatic elements, the betrayal, the theft, the revenge, but because of how it ended. Because Emma had chosen to transform her trauma into something that could help others. Because she had proven that the opposite of cruelty isn't just kindness, but the deliberate choice to be kind even when you have every reason not to be. Young people who'd been through similar experiences reached out to the foundation, inspired by Emma's story. Some of them had also been betrayed by people who were supposed to protect them. Some were still trapped in situations like the one Emma had escaped. Each one found in Emma's story a roadmap, not for revenge, but for survival and eventual triumph. The foundation grew, expanding to multiple cities. Victoria completed her 5-year service and, to everyone's surprise, asked to continue as a volunteer. She would never be forgiven by many. And she didn't ask to be, but she spent the rest of her life trying to prevent other children from suffering as Emma had. It wasn't redemption, exactly. But it was something. Richard Thornton, who had never shown a moment of remorse, served his full prison sentence and faded into obscurity. Morrison lost everything and never practiced again. The systems that had failed Emma, the schools, the counselors, the child services that had accepted Victoria's lies without proper investigation, were forced to examine their procedures and make changes. But the real victory was quieter and more personal. It was Emma waking up without fear. It was Emma laughing freely, without the weight of performance. It was her ability to trust again, to love again, to believe in her own worth. It was her transformation from victim to survivor to thriver. 10 years after her father's death, Emma stood at his grave on a crisp autumn day. She was 26 now, running a successful foundation, engaged to James, and genuinely happy. She placed flowers on the headstone, the same kind of flowers they'd planted together all those years ago. "I made it, Dad," she said softly. "It was hard and there were times I didn't think I would, but I made it. And I'm not just surviving, I'm living. Really living. The kind of life you would have wanted for me, full of purpose and love and hope." The wind rustled through the leaves, carrying with it the promise of new seasons and new beginnings. Emma had learned that betrayal, especially from those meant to protect us, leaves scars that never fully disappear. But she'd also learned that those scars can become a kind of map, showing us where we've been and reminding us of our strength. They can make us bitter or they can make us bitter, and the choice is ours alone. She chose better. And in choosing better, in refusing to let Victoria's cruelty define her, Emma had won a victory far greater than any revenge could have provided. She had reclaimed not just her inheritance, but her humanity. She had proven that the measure of a person isn't what's done to them, but what they choose to do in response. As Emma walked away from her father's grave that day, the sun broke through the clouds, painting the cemetery in golden light. She felt her father's presence, not as a ghost or a memory, but as something living within her, his values, his kindness, his belief in doing right even when it's hard. Victoria had tried to destroy a little girl. But that little girl had grown into a woman Victoria could never have anticipated, someone who understood that the deed of cruelty isn't revenge, but the radical act of building something beautiful from broken pieces. That was Emma's secret. The one she'd carried back to Riverside Manor 8 years after Victoria's betrayal. Not a secret of revenge but of resilience. Not a plan for destruction, but a blueprint for healing, her own and that of countless others who would find hope in her foundation. In the end, Emma Clark didn't just survive Victoria's betrayal. She transcended it, transformed it, and used it as the foundation for a life of meaning and purpose. And that was the sweetest victory of all. Not because Victoria suffered, but because Emma flourished despite everything Victoria had done to prevent it. The little girl who had stood shivering outside Riverside Manor, had come home at last, not to reclaim what was taken, but to build something far more valuable than anything that could be stolen. She had come home to herself. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of your own strength or gave you hope for the future, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. We share stories of resilience, justice, and the unbreakable human spirit. Because everyone deserves to know that no matter how dark things seem, no matter who tries to break you, you have the power to rebuild yourself into something even stronger. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it today. Your support helps us reach more people who need these reminders that they're not alone, and that justice, real, meaningful justice, is always worth fighting for. Ease.